So my name's Chris Riley. I was most recently in the marketing communications group at Apple, the company that used to be called Apple Computer. It's now called Apple Inc. Prior to that, I was a consultant on global brands. Prior to that, I led the strategic function of an ad agency called Leyden & Kennedy that brought you Nike globally, Microsoft globally, I'm sorry, and various other big global brands. So my history has been working with global brands, making big television spots and thinking strategically about their relationship with the consumer.
And in Apple, could you tell a little bit more about kind of what you've been doing and how long were you with
So I was
Apple?
at Apple for 5 years, and we created the marketing communications group out of a merger between I'm going to start again.
Okay.
I was at Apple for 5 years, where we merged marketing communications and graphic design to create Apple.com and to support Steve and the marketing folks in getting their message out to the world.
And you were, my understanding was it,
I was head of strategic planning there, so
Sure.
my job was to help understand what people would relate to and how to communicate most effectively using these media.
Wow. So some people think of Apple as kind of really break it open, this mobile space, and all its different pieces, the simple to use device, the apps and all that. I mean, when you think about your experience there and where you're coming from, what was the kind of trajectory of how this kind of world started to really open up?
I think I think it's worth remembering that Apple were not in the mobile phone space. So when I was working with Nokia, nobody would have imagined Apple as being a leading company in the mobile phone space, which is of course what they've become. So back then there were two industries. There was a mobile phone industry and there was a computer industry. Computers were becoming increasingly mobile and phones were becoming increasingly computer-like. So when you had a look at the Nokia communicator, I can't remember whether it's the N something, but the communicator actually flipped up like a little laptop and performed much like a mobile phone. So I think if you were sitting in Samsung or Sony Ericsson or LG or Motorola or Nokia, you were really looking at the world through the lens of two things. One was whether or not the cellular infrastructure was going to evolve at a rate that will allow you to provide high bandwidth data communications. A company like Nokia had an inside track on that because they were developing the infrastructure. They invented SMS, if you recall. And secondarily, what was the driving behavior amongst the consumer that would accept such data stuff, if you like. So the big news back when I was at Nokia before joining Apple was the arrival and potential of 3G. And so if you look at that through the lens of a mobile phone user, you're struggling, in fact, to try and understand what this little handset would do. So you ended up on, you can watch live football if you're in the UK, or you can do some basic email, or you can begin to do some of the things that you might otherwise have used a computer to do. The idea that the mobile phone would become an internet device in the way that it has now become was difficult to imagine, partly because of form factor and partly because of current use. Now, over in Japan, they had a big lead on this because in Japan they had a different product and infrastructure, and actually they were already fully operational as kind of a networked youth accepted mobile phones as a primary means of communication, and they were also late adopters to the PC, partly because Windows took a long time to get into Japanese, but also because they tend to live outside. They don't have, this is Palo Alto, they don't have this, right? They tend to live in very dense kind of urban settings. So even though that was going on, I remember not really imagining, I don't think back then I could have imagined what we now know as the iPad. So then you switch your world view and you look at the world through the lens of a computer, and you're asking a different set of questions. You're going, I wonder how we can improve the experience of people whilst they're mobile. What are people really enjoying today? And increasingly what you saw was that computers were being used as another form of media. People were beginning to listen to a bit of radio on their computer, or they were watching a bit of TV, or they were watching some movies, or they were listening to music. We'd had the iPod. The iPod had already been out, which had been like this extraordinary change of behavior where people suddenly could store stuff on little devices, but it was all hubbed around the computer. So even at Microsoft, they knew, if you went to CES 10 years ago, people knew sort of intellectually that there was a role for the computer as a hub to entertainment. So if you were in that mindset, you would then begin to imagine a different kind of set of devices. And that's what I think happened with Apple, which is that they were looking at the world very much from the lens, the only company that looked at the world from the lens of what do people really want to do, and what technologies are coming along which will allow them to do what they really want to do. This is not the same as the mobile phone business, which was looking at how to maintain a relationship with the carriers, how to expand the data flow. They have ARPU, how much data can we persuade people to use, and all of that. You come to Cupertino, where there were obviously people with experience in the mobile phone business, but that's not the question they were asking. They were asking, what kind of amazing device can we create that people will really, really, really enjoy? And that's, I think, that mindset, which is an Apple mindset, is then tied to the fact that they're in control, which is a really important thing. They're in control of the software experience, they're in control of the hardware experience, and they've already started to build really great internet services. Over at Nokia, the Symbian was like 5 people in a cave somewhere. They didn't really perceive the handset as an integrated software-hardware services play. They saw it as a piece of hardware. And then you went over to Microsoft, and they saw everything in terms of software play. And you went over to Korea, and they just saw bundling. What we need is a good operating system, Windows, you'll do, We can assemble all this stuff. And within that world, it's just the same as the PC world. You're never going to get somebody holistically thinking about what is the experience of my mother when she opens the box and starts using this product, which has always been the great gift Apple has brought to the world, a fully integrated experience designed to kind of delight you. And so that is just their expertise, and it's been their expertise since the Apple was invented in 1984. And it turned out that put them in exactly the right place to pull together the product that people really liked. So I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but it's, it's the brilliance of the company, but it's also the history of thinking through how you deliver an experience to an individual.
And is that behavior that was driving all this? So what would people want to do? Well, how would they like to use technology as a whole? Is that changing now we have different technology, or do you think the basic drivers are more or less the same?
That's a really good question. Clearly, we do things which we didn't do before when we can do them, right? However, I've had some difficulty in finding a consumer behavior which is genuinely new. And so a great example of that is social networking. So in the Valley, social networking is software utilities enabled by the internet, and it's known by companies like Facebook and all of those guys. But out in the real world, social network is hanging with your friends, or it's going down the club, or it's visiting your parents. So there's an interesting challenge, I think, for technologists, which is I think they find it quite hard to move from the world as described through the process and mechanics of technologies. So when I say network as an engineer, I am actually thinking of package switching systems and train stations, right? But when I say network to somebody who wants to get a job in New York, they're thinking of people. And it's those two worlds which which then collide and create something interesting. So therefore the question for me is, are there any behaviors which any of us are engaged in that actually we didn't engage in before? Well, we kind of dated, and now we date in a different way. We organised our friends to go down to a bar. We now do that in a different way. We find our way to a new office or, to a party. We used to always be late, and now we're less frequently late and more frequently phoning up saying Google's got it wrong. But I wonder whether or not our fundamental behaviours have changed in terms of the fundamental human motivations. So when people look aghast at my kids, who can somehow self-organise to a 50-person party in half an hour without uttering a word, they go, this is extraordinary. Whereas in fact, we've been doing this for years, but we've just been doing it in different ways. So it's when technology solves a problem that has already been around. You know, a great one for me is I'm a transplant, so I'm an American, but I'm from Manchester. And you know, the longer you live away from your place of birth, if you like, the smaller the number of things you miss. And one of the things that I miss is Radio 4, which is talk radio in the United Kingdom. Well, soon as the internet enabled me to listen to Radio 4, bam! Soon as Airfoil was launched and I could broadcast from my computer to my stereo, bam! Radio 4 was back in my life after like a 20-year absence. It's about 15-year absence. Go to my house now, I walk into the house and turn on the BBC, because that's what I like. So it's not that there's a new behaviour there, it's that the technology has suddenly satisfied, or made it easier, or more simple, or cheaper, or quicker to do something I really wanted to do in the first place. So my suspicion is aroused when I see technologists talking about there's going to be new behaviour, new human experience as a consequence of these technologies. Because I think whilst that's possible, they happen rarely. In fact, they happen extraordinarily rarely. And therefore those technological achievements like the wheel, or you can print words and read them, those things really do change. But most technologies are solving problems people already have. And if you look at the problems people have got and then solve them, that's probably the right way to look at it.
So in some respects, if you're thinking out 10 years,
right.
One kind of larger point you're trying to make here is essentially a lot of the evidence is in front of your face right now of how people act, and just think about how technology would enable that. Is that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly correct. So if you have a look at what's really so what do people really need right now? So there are two big needs which are problematic in the West, actually all over the world right now. World's changing, blah blah blah. Our economy's changing. So number one, we're all getting older. We need better healthcare. Number two, we're all getting older, and our ability to work is changing, and so therefore there's a worldwide growth in demand for education. And education used to be organised around factories, and now it needs to be organised around knowledge and mobility and all of those kind of things. So those are two drivers. Number one, more people need more healthcare more of the time, more affordably. Number two, more people need more education more of the time, more affordably. So if you were looking forward 10 years, you would be asking questions about, okay, well, how does that manifest? And how can technology answer? So then if you look at, say, education, there are issues that range from, you know what, the world's an interesting place, I just want to improve myself, to, I've got some pretty serious study to do to get accredited and get a different kind of job. So there are any number, or if you're in, I just came back from Bangladesh, if you're in Bangladesh, everybody's really hungry for a good education. Nobody can afford it. So the problem there is, how can you distribute education efficiently to a large number of people? Because you know that they really want to be educated. So then what do they want to be educated in? Da, 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 da. So I think technologies are going to really, really move quickly to begin to answer these really big human needs, of which I've just mentioned two. But those two alone will transform the world. If you can figure out how to educate people throughout their entire life relatively affordably and easily, and solve the problem of accreditation and distribute it globally, well, recent uprisings in the Middle East just become a warm-up act to a wholesale transformation of the way people live their lives. So that's way more interesting than Twitter, right? So Twitter is just like, well, we all gossip and we all like to share stuff, but it's capped at this kind of get the news out behavior. And sometimes that's really significant in countries that have limited access to good media. And sometimes it's just really annoying in America, when politicians are twittering that they've gone to good restaurants or that they've just voted on a bill. That's kind of annoying. But you can actually see that these underlying drivers are going to start being answered by technology, and they're very, 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 very disruptive.
Do you think, though, I mean, not maybe on the level of the wheel and the printing press, as you mentioned, but don't you think this ability to have very powerful computerized power in your hand to carry with you anywhere you go and be connected always is a pretty key breakthrough? I mean, it's a pretty fundamental breakthrough.
It could be, actually. So that was all a precursor to saying that it could be. So, and obviously there are layers of technological change. So the wheel, fire, and writing were important developments. Television was very important, but probably not as important as TV in terms of its changed what it's changed, but it's still pretty important. And so one of the things that I was interested in is comparing people's adoption. So I'm 52, so my entire life is a product of the television age. So 1969, man goes on the moon, Concorde, you don't know Concorde in America, it was a very fast airplane, flies for the first time. In 1967, the Beatles produced the very first global telecast from Apple in London, and they sung All You Need Is Love, right? Which is kind of interesting, first time the species speaks to itself, it talks about that. And so those kind of dramatic changes define my entire world. It defines how my democracy works, it defines my entertainment values, it defines my cultural values, it defines the way I relate to events on the other side of the world, etc., etc., etc. Television. The amazing thing about TV in the United States was just after the Second World War, between around 1947, when nobody had TV, and Ed Sullivan was just a dream, to about 1958, when I was born, you see people in the United States go from 0 to 80% of households in the United States had a television. Right? It was triggered by the Ed Sullivan Show, which was run by NBC, which was owned by RCA, that made the television sets, right? So there's this confluence of, to use our current jargon, the hardware, the software, and the service, right? 80% penetration in 10 years after a world war, okay, America was richer than Europe, right? It's still an extraordinary rate of growth. And it basically tells you that that nobody didn't want one. That the only reason you didn't have a television in your home was you either couldn't afford it or there was no signal in your area. So those were the two defining factors. That leaves a population of the United States, all of whom wanted television. Now at that time, a lot of people are rural, they want to queue into the cities. So live from New York City, connected the rural areas to the urban areas. Well, now we all live in cities, so it's different, right? But nonetheless, that growth. So I was interested in the growth of something like the iPad. Okay, so I think there are 11 million iPads out there in the world right now. 11 million. This thing is less than a year old, and there are 11 million iPad users in the world. And I read in the New York Times that they're roughly predicting 28 million sales of the iPad this year. So that's amazing. And then I would go to CES in Vegas, Samsung, Sony, every single manufacturer on the planet has some version of the iPad. Obviously none of them are as good, but they will get that way in the near future. So a conservative estimate would have you, let's just say Android is average, just assume that Android is average, and that the Galaxy Tab from Samsung is quite good, versus the iPad, which is great, and iOS, which is great. But looking at the numbers, let's just conservatively say, I'll guess, another 30 million. So that means you're at a run rate of 0 to 80 million users in 18 months, right? That is new. That is, and you can kind of go into the sterile world of, well, the adoption rate of the iPod was this, but this is new because this is a media technology. So this is about the way we communicate with each other. And so people have their television, and now they have what we call a mobile device, although it's not always used because it's mobile, it just happens to be convenient. But now I can interact with my TV, I can just watch any program I ever want, whenever I want it, which has been the ultimate goal of every consumer since television. Nobody sat around going, look, I'm really glad that the television stations only broadcast Gilligan's Island at 5 o'clock each day. Nobody kind of went, wow, this is a great way to live your life. I have to rush home. So as soon as we were given videotape recorders, we started time delaying things because it's not natural. What we really want is to sit down and have the entertainment we want right there, right now. And so that's what this technology does. So somebody can say to you, did you see some TV show? And you can say no, but now you don't say, I missed it. You say, oh, I think I'll watch that. And you see the first one, and it's for free on the ABC app on the iPad. So the first one's free. And you go, wow, what a great series. Is it worth $10 to buy the rest in the series right now and watch them back to back? It's really great value, bam. And so all our behaviors around media are altered by this particular kind of device. And if you think that the history, particularly in this democratic country, without even thinking about what's going on in countries out there, is you can even track your presidents by media changes. You know, Lincoln was about TV, Andrew Jackson was about direct mail, FDR was about radio, Nixon and Kennedy triggered the television thing, Reagan mastered it, Obama is the first one who kind of began to flirt with social media. So that signals a really enormous impact. So the question is, you're asking the right question, is this revolution as big as the really big ones that really do change the way our societies operate? And I think it is, actually. I think that this is the single most exciting, frightening, dangerous, ridiculous event in my life. My parents, who are in their late 80s, are still struggling with the horrifying reality of television, right? And this thing comes along, and it's like in their own lifetime they've seen two enormous, although interestingly, and I've heard this anecdote quite frequently, my dad, I've worked in cars, sneakers, technology, all manner of things. My dad has never asked me for anything until 2 weeks after the iPad was launched. And he literally phones me from Manchester and he goes, you know, I think I could do with one of those. Well, why? Well, I've heard that I can go and watch and see some favourite shows from when he was young, and he can sit and he can watch them.
So when you say this thing, you mean
The iPad.
the iPad, not just the iPhone or mobility. You're
No, the
saying.
iPad.
So explain that a little bit more of why that beyond the iPhone or just basic mobility or the whole thing.
Well, I think the iPad has got a number of innovations which are nothing to do with it being mobile. I mean, it's got its interactive screen at that scale works really well. The definition of the screen is really great. The relationship it has through iTunes to media is really amazing, and so on and so forth. So it's a confluence of different things. Galaxy are running advertising right now that says the perfect size. So there's obviously going to be some kind of size wars like there always has been in television. But fundamentally, I think its form factor and the way it invites you to interact with media or data makes it very different to an iPhone. And in fact, I think this is what iPhone really always wanted to be. The iPhone still sits within the phone, and you know, I'm a bit of a geek, so I have both, of course. But really, the iPad to me, unlike the iPhone, signals a deep change in the way people want to and can consume media. So it is, in fact, a better way to read a newspaper. It is, in fact, a better way to listen to the NPR app. Just hands down, it's worth $400 for the NPR app, the New York Times. You know, most people when they get, oh, here's a good example. The average student in California spends $1,200 a year on textbooks. So if you can stop printing them, distribute them as electronic books, you can really save a lot of money. And nobody's hanging out there going, I really wish we could continue printing textbooks, because they incinerate half of them at the end of the year to keep them all up to date for the next cycle. So this is one of the most hateful, uncomfortable, unpopular aspects of the education system. So there are various, you know, you can look at the numbers. If you look at the state of Oregon, they probably spend around $50 million a year on textbooks. Or your student, if you've got kids, you know, they phone you up and they go, Dad, I need 2 more textbooks, and it's like $150 or $200. So you're going to see schools very, very soon switch to electronic publishing and give the iPad away because it's cheaper. It saves them a fortune. It's cheaper to shove an iPad in the back of your backpack and have all your textbooks there. And then you integrate communication through email, security things. At one of the colleges, I saw this amazing thing where if a girl is traveling home at night, she can punch in a number, and when she gets home, she punches in another number, and it's GPS. And so campus security knows where she is. If she doesn't punch in when she gets home, they dispatch a security officer. Wow. It's just like, it's a no-brainer, right? Is that worth $400, $500? Absolutely. And so it has so much richness to it, and everybody's richness is slightly different to everybody else's, that the price suddenly becomes worth paying. So yeah, so it's the best newspaper, it's the best TV, it's the best radio, it's the best way of looking at films. It's got the best, all the way down the line, because when they launched it, they built on the shoulders of these other technologies and did something pretty darn amazing. Wow. And I think its adoption rate signals that that's how people feel. I haven't met a single person who doesn't want an iPad. I've met lots of people who say, I don't need one. That's different. I've met lots of people that say, it doesn't replace my laptop. That's different. But I've never met anybody look me square in the eyes and go, I just don't want one. It doesn't look very interesting to me. So that's ubiquitous demand. So you could imagine a world in, let's see, 2000 and, what we knew, 11, 12, 13, 14, 215, where you can assume this is the ubiquitous media. So then you have a look at the industry and you go, okay, just thinking about it as a media device, not thinking about it as a communication tool or any of those other things, just as a media device, you realize, oh, right, the world just changed. Seriously, the way our democracy works just changed. The way we educate ourselves just changed. Not tweeting and Facebooking. This is serious stuff. So yeah, I think it's potentially a really enormous moment.
We look into education, and you say it's going to be broadly adopted inside the education space. Do we then also start to educate people on the use of this type of technology more? So how do you deal with interruptions? How do you deal with the overload of information? How do you?
Well, we already
how do you run your life?
We already are. So most of the things you just mentioned are already issues being faced by students today. So they are. But I think the reason it's a good question you're asking is you go into, I don't know, you go into any educational, let's just take a state school or college, something like that, and you get the teachers and you put them all in a room. Some of them are going to be between the age of 30 and 40, and some are going to be between the ages of 50 and 60, and you may have a few who are a little older than that. And so they will broadly break down into people who think this technology is absolutely fantastic and they're fully operational and they're going to educate this way. Some are going to go, wow, this is new. That sounds like retraining to me, but I'm kind of into it. I've got a long career ahead of me. I really want to be a great teacher, and my students need this, so I'm in. And some of them, which I call retired and unannounced, just go, it's over. It's over. I'm just going to give up. I'm just going to coast now till my retirement day because I'm not emotionally, skillfully, or even mentally equipped to be interested in this. What I really like is blackboards and the old way. So if you talk to that younger group, and even some of the middle group, what they tell you is they go, well, here's a really cool thing. Lectures used to be everybody sitting around listening to lectures, and lecturers find that really boring. They have to do the same lecture every time there's an undergraduate class. Everybody goes home, they do their homework. Well, I don't know if you heard, but the other thing that happens on the internet is everybody cheats, apparently including the defense minister for Germany right now. So everybody cheats. Why do they cheat? Well, they cheat because we learn communally. So you can either say people cheat and you can take that kind of moral overtone to it and all people go, well, all the students cheat today, which, you know, makes me laugh. Or you can go, there's an impulse. We actually learn better when we were with other people, which is what most good educators understand, social learning, right? So now the people with this technology go, everybody gets together at the beginning of the class and the teacher just goes, all right, well, you've got the lecture, you've all watched it, now let's talk about the lecture. So he can assume, or she can assume, that the students all saw the lecture over the weekend or on their own time or when the kids were put to bed or after work or whatever is most convenient to that individual. And the individual knows that when they get to the classroom, they're going to have a communal experience about the knowledge. This is a better way of teaching. And so the only people who would reject that are good people who just are not up for that change. They just like the old way. And that's completely acceptable for some as well. But all the energy is in this other camp. So it's a good question. The question is, do we retrain? Are there new skills? And I go, yeah, but it's already happening. And again, any of those of us, everybody who you talk to who has teenage children is fully aware that this process is underway. And so when you hear people fighting it, particularly in the education system, you're just hearing people who are afraid. And they're not afraid of educating children or teenagers. They're afraid for their own livelihood, or they're afraid about their own competence, or there are many other reasons why educators should be afraid right now. But it's not about whether or not technology can improve education.
Just shifting a slightly bit here is the working title for this book is The App Effect.
Right.
And it's really trying to look, at least in the current prism, of how apps have opened up this space very quickly. I'm curious, from your perspective, what you think of the critical or not, what is the impact of apps and the simplification of access to information, and how you see, how critical or not you see that, question. And then how far you would say, or is this a transitional thing, or you think it's something that will still be kind of steady through the next 10 years here or so?
It could be just a phase technology is going through. I mean, to me, apps are simply a fairly quick, easy way of accessing an application for a device. So in that sense, there's been constant progress about that. 7 disks to install Microsoft Word in 1988, through to optical disks to download it. It just feels natural that there will always be advances in the way we can have applications on devices. So in that regard, it's not that interesting. And already you're beginning to see, should I read the New York Times in HTML5, or should I read the New York Times on an app? And I had an argument actually in a bar with a friend of mine about this after a couple of beers, because to me the app is way better than the HTML experience, and he just disagrees. So that sounds to me as though we're two old men disagreeing about nonsense. It seems that he prefers one way of reading his newspaper and I prefer another. So in that regard, doesn't seem to be the right question. It feels that it's just a well-branded mechanism for downloading software in that regard. There is another question which is about stuff sitting on the internet that you can access versus stuff sitting on your device that you can access. And I think that's not a particularly interesting question either, because from the public's point of view, they're just using their device. So the app thing. What is clear though is that, well, one way of looking at the app is that it's a method of downloading software to a device. Another way of looking at the app is that it is a constrained design environment. So if you take my argument with my friend about should I read it on the web, or most people, most normal people, actually find the internet quite confusing. It's pretty difficult to navigate, pretty unreliable, and when you get to individual sites, none of them are the same. So if you're used to buying your stuff at Amazon, you learn how to buy one way. If you go to eBay, there's another way. It's pretty confusing, and so actually satisfaction with the internet is quite low. However, the benefit of the internet is so high that people are willing to go through those experiences and still say it's great, which is kind of an interesting conundrum. So let's look at it another way. If I said to you, if I took you to Milan and put you on a street corner and said, Peter, AC Milan just played Manchester United and I don't know what the football score is. Could you find out? You could probably find the results from a from a street corner in Milan. I would give you a minute to 2 minutes. You would see a newspaper vendor, you would buy a newspaper, and even though you didn't speak Italian, you may, you would find the sports scores, bam. Why? Well, you understand, you have a mental map of the street, you have a mental map of a newspaper vendor, and you have a mental map of a newspaper, which is the same everywhere. The New York Times defined it back in the day. So the sports scores in any language in any newspaper are, broadly speaking, where you would expect them. So that kind of notion of the mental map, I think, is important. Another example is, if I was to have like Star Trek and I could beam you to a department store, let's say Macy's, and I beamed you in and you landed by Power Tools, and I said, Peter, you've got to buy a gift for your wife from the lingerie section. You could actually find your way there, because you'd instantly go, well, I'm near Power Tools, that's nowhere near lingerie. And then, because you have a mental map of a department store, if I put you in Safeway, and I put you by pharmaceuticals and said buy an apple, you can scan it. You can actually scan a supermarket based on colour, because colour of packaging is semiotic, and you've mapped it. And nearly all supermarkets are the same. So that notion of a kind of mental map of information, I think, is incredibly important to this conversation. Because what I believe happened was the design constraints of the app as it went to the iPhone were considerable. So the number of different experiences you can have when using an app are limited. So when you learn your first app, you've sort of learnt your second and your third and your fourth. So suddenly, even if they increase in complexity, even if those design rules are relaxed, there becomes a familiarity, particularly when you've only got one button, you've got some swiping motions, you've got some this, and you've got some this and some of this. People learn it. So what I actually think is that the internet is too chaotic for most people to enjoy it most of the time. So any device that allows you to get the benefits of the internet, I can find something quickly, I can be entertained, I can be informed, blah, 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 whatever it is. If I can put it into a way of thinking that you already have, and it's therefore a familiar process, then you'll buy it. And I think that's actually the big story of apps. It's not that it's downloadable software, it's just that it introduces new design constraints. And an old friend of ours, Peter Schwartz, once said to me, have you noticed that all planes are the same? Do you think that Boeing has cracked the design of the plane? It's like the perfect way to fly hundreds of people around the world. I'm like, well, I assume so. And he goes, no. No, in fact, it's really inefficient, hanging the engines under the wings, sticking them towards the back, having a long tubular fuselage. Ridiculous way of flying people around the world. So I asked him, well, why? Well, come on, oh, mighty Peter. What is the answer? And he said, airports. Once you've spent X $100 million putting in jetways and airports, and that they are designed to service long fuselages with doors in them, you've locked it down. And you've locked it down to a way of travel that is actually quite difficult to unlock. So they could invent the world's most efficient airliner now and it would have nowhere to land. Well, I think that's kind of interesting as a story for this as well. There's been a sort of lockdown on how we will use apps. And that's a good thing right now. Now, sometime in the distant future, it will not be a good thing, but those of us who talked to Peter and learned about lockdown, which is what I learned about, can understand its initial benefit. We locked down to the combustion engine, we locked down to the fuselage thing with Boeing, etc., etc. And now we're locking into this app experience, which for a given period of time will allow people to design experiences on mobile devices that are really great. Really, really, really great. And so therefore I think it's an important, it's really, really, really important.
Fantastic. Do you anticipate now, looking ahead, let's think about the future a little bit here too, as
Right.
we kind of move to that phase of the, if you had to just throw out some ideas, and this
Right.
is the spirit of brainstorming in a way, you know, what are the kind of things you'd say could really affect that mobile experience in the next 10 years? So for example, you know, really good voice recognition.
No, I'm not sure I'm the right person to ask
Well, no,
about
okay, well, maybe not about that. I'm just saying, in your world, are there any things, or even coming out of your experiences recently, there's now people saying that the payments, you know, there'll be a whole payment infrastructure through phones and things
yeah,
like
but
that.
my knowledge is not that great about the technologies that
okay,
are maybe
okay.
coming.
Okay,
So I
okay.
don't really know how to answer that. But,
Okay, well, then that's,
But on the usage side, so if you look at an iPhone, you say, well, that's sort of the. It seems for now, as always, we've reached the top of the device. It's a phone, data connected, voice, some sensors, a screen that you can touch. It can't go much further from here. Could
it
be a
doesn't
way of
feel
thinking.
that way, does it? You're right.
And so the question is then, will we see dramatic changes in how we use that, or dramatic changes in, I don't know, adoption, or?
We actually don't use these devices for much right now. So therefore I would assume we're going to use them for a lot more than we're currently using them. And there are uses that we would think today are ridiculous, and in 10 years' time will be perfectly normal. Ordering food to come to your house. I mean, the thing that blew me away, I'm a very simple guy actually, and I like to drive, so I don't typically get taxis. And then so I found out that actually I can order a taxi now just by getting my iPhone out and going, here I am. And a taxi turns up in Portland, Oregon, takes me to the airport. That avoids all the social pain of somebody who's a bit shy, which, believe it or not, I am, of ordering a taxi, you know, you phone up. So I would never have imagined that very simple use. So I think there's a plethora of simple uses. You know, there's not enough blackberry jam in your fridge. 5 years ago, I'd have thought stupid. But now a fridge that actually takes inventory of important things and orders them from Safeway automatically, I think it actually sounds a really good thing.
mhm.
And actually I've heard that kind of system could be incredibly important as we go into a world where we have to reduce our energy consumption. The idea of a very efficient deliveries of important goods to individuals, organised so we're not all driving around in our cars at the wrong time and forgetting things, like efficiency to that system could be a very good thing. But I think there are other areas I'm more
Okay, so it
more
doesn't have to be
aware
in
of.
technology, but just let's think of 10 years out. If you were to say kind of your own thoughts on potential wildcards out there, and it doesn't have to be in technology, it could be in how people behave,
okay.
how they
I think
might
the
reject
behavior
it,
thing
or
is the interesting
how young people might, you know, do or not do, or,
So-
you know, or I was thinking, you know, what if these devices turn out to cause the brain cancer that some people worry about? I mean, there's just things that are just things I'm just curious in your mind that you
So I think
point
I
out
have to
think
stick to
about.
the areas that I know
Yeah,
about,
totally.
and
Go for it.
I can riff on, because I think there are some really big changes which are going to create enormous pain and ultimately enormous joy. My kids are 18 and 22, so they're not really kids. So I am the beginning of the end of the generation that put their kids through school. I think that is inevitable. The idea of a bad building, badly managed, run by people with inflexible skills, educating the public in an era when they have easy access to the best knowledge is insane. And actually everybody knows it's insane. So there isn't a single country in the world that is not going through a public education crisis today. And that crisis is only going to be accelerated by this technology, because it is now far more effective to allow your kid to learn at their own pace, following their own curiosity, guided by the right people, in the place that they desire, than it is to send them to school. School as an institution that we are familiar with. I'm not saying schooling or the importance of public education. I'm not being political. I'm looking at the process and the way it manifests in our society. It's going to change. So I cannot imagine when I'm an old man, I don't think my grandchildren will go to school. Not a school that I recognize. And I think it's rather disturbing, actually, that the school my teenagers went to was in fact the same as the school I went to. That's always disturbed me, because I always imagined the world would have changed. So what could it change to? Well, there are many, many scenarios, but the industrial model of the factory was that all the workers turned up and worked at the factory, right? So school is a factory. So what have we done to the factory? Well, we've sent some of it to Asia, we've sent management to Europe, and we've sent IT to India, and we've disassembled that process. It's no longer in the same building, and all the experts are where they need to be, and they're all communicating really effectively. I think that's what's going to happen to schools, which is, instead of being geographically located buildings within which expertise is housed, they will be simply community centres around which people can congregate in order to have the communal and social aspects of learning, maybe some guidance. It's going to be true as much for little tiny children as it is for colleges. So that's one thing. The second thing is that if you take that line of thinking and you go, all right, so Harvard, are you a Harvard guy?
I'm not. I went to Columbia.
Columbia. So you're a very well-educated guy, way better than me. But a place like Columbia, let's stick to Harvard, has a global reputation. Anywhere you go in the world, people think of the Harvard, let's call it a brand. So how did the Citadel get created? Well, it was created when it was actually incredibly expensive to, if you wanted to get an education with the best professors, back in, whenever Harvard was founded, and they all lived where the fuck they want, they all lived wherever they wanted, right? They all lived wherever they wanted. Imagine trying to get an education, right? So you're sitting in Portland, Oregon, and the professor for this is in San Francisco, the professor for that is in New Orleans. There's 3 professors who have holed up in a mountain somewhere because they can't stand cities. Walt Whitman is off wherever he has gone. It's impossible. So what these institutions did was they brought all these people into the same place, they housed them, they fed them, they built a kind of educational citadel, and they said, look, if you come here, we've got them all together. We're like the great aggregator. So we got used to that. So Oxford, Cambridge, Manchester, Harvard, Yale, Columbia, all these great institutions compete by attracting professors who get on planes, relocate families, and go to those places. Well, I don't know if it's just that I work in weird circles, but increasingly in my circle of friends, who tend to be in what we now call the creative industries, one of the big motivations is to live where they want to live. So I have friends, I got a friend, a brilliant guy here, who likes walking up in Marin and around the headlands here. So he's going to stay here. I've got another friend who adores New York. I've got another friend who lives out in Idaho. I myself spend a lot of my time living in a 300-person town in Oregon. How do we work together? Because those people I've just described to you are currently working together on a project. So it's because we're using technology. So as soon as you've done that, you've actually undermined the economic model of the university as we know it. So what you've got left? Well, you've got a brand. So Harvard could basically blow the entire thing up, keep the brand name, and begin to operationalize it in a fundamentally different way. So that's one world. In fact, there was an exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London a few years back, and it was about design. And in the catalogue, they had a whole thing about brands and brand design, which is my world. And they said a very truthful thing. They said if the entire operational capacity of Coca-Cola were to be destroyed overnight, the company would have a problem. But if everybody's memory of Coca-Cola was eradicated, the company would go away. And I think Harvard's in that space. So as soon as you get there, you go, right, so the relationship with educators and education changes dramatically. And as we know, when you do that, you're also enabling new competitors. So the reason why the unknown college, Concordia, which is somewhere, can't even remember where it is now, or Evergreen, or any number of actually really great schools that exist around the country that attract a modest number of students, charge very modest rates. Nobody's ever heard of them, so they kind of compete. Those guys can now access a global market for education and become quite spiritualized, quite focused. And they'll get focused in a number of different ways. One way they could get focused is culturally. A whole bunch of Catholic colleges, a whole bunch of Jewish colleges, a whole bunch of Muslim colleges. Another way they could get focused is through skill sets. So you can see this all happen, and then suddenly your 18-year-old guy who's got a modest amount of money to spend on his or her education can go, right, scan. What's the benefit of $40,000 plus all the rest a year to fly me all the way to Harvard when I can piece it together myself? In which case you've got an accreditation crisis, which is easily solved by reasonably good regulation, and the whole world changes. So I think that our experience of education, which is a passion of mine, is going through a transformation which is actually bewildering to most people who are in it right now. And maybe as part of your project, you should talk to a few teenagers sitting at SF State and ask them their worldview, because it's very uncertain. Whereas when I was at college, it was a simple bargain. Dad got me in, government paid for me, I get a better job.
Totally.
It's not like that for a kid who's 18, 19 or 20. So that's one area.
That's totally good area. One thing that has been in the back of my mind as you're doing this, and we're kind of winding up here a little bit, but there is this personal connection thing that basically video connections are opening up.
Yep.
And also we're watching with the the iPhone now with the FaceTime, and now the iPad just came out with FaceTime. I mean, how important in the next 10 years do you think the experience of people live through the video channels is?
Very.
Talk about why that's so important and where you think it's going.
But it's not important as a driver. It's more important. You know, it's back to that thing I was saying earlier on, that people want to do the things they want to do.
Well, no, you were talking about the video connection thing.
Yeah, so video connection is about the fact that we want to be connected to each other as people. So it's answering that fundamental human need that I talked about before. So the bigger question is, in what way do we want to be connected with other people? And in what way have we not been connected to other people in the past? And so on the one hand, social networking, as it's depicted in the Fincher movie, et cetera, is just a mechanism whereby you can do trivial social connections. But on the other hand, I see it as an impulse which has been suppressed dramatically for generations, particularly in the United States, which has a very fragmented culture because of its immigrant history. Less so in countries like Bangladesh, India, China. So therefore you have to go, okay, well, what is the fundamental thing that's going to evolve as a consequence of the fact that people can connect with each other in a better way? For example, video. And the answer is more powerful communal experiences, real communal experiences, not trivial ones. I'm a sports fan, will you date me? Well, that can be quite important to some people. And note how successful it's been with Match.com and eHarmony and all those guys. On the one hand, you can say, wow, that's pretty silly. On the other hand, holy moly, people didn't know how to find a partner, and now they do. It's actually really, really powerful. So I think this notion of community is more important than people are giving it credit for. I think that we're moving from a culture which has venerated the individual to a culture which will be defined by the community. And that has an extraordinary impact on everything. So if you have a look at the history of the presidency, it wasn't always an imperial presidency. It wasn't always a big important person at the top talking to everybody. There have been moments in the history of the presidency when he's been very invisible because he plays a very managerial governor. The Constitution doesn't say we need a massive hero at the top of this thing. It says we need an executive branch that's independent of the legislature. So even in that sphere of life, we have transformed the role in our lifetime, in the lifetime of television, from being a functional part of government to being an individual heroic role. So I look at Obama and I look at Bush. You know, obviously I didn't like Bush, I'm normal, right? And I kind of like this one. But the bigger question is, do I expect too much of the president? And the answer in my mind is, I do. So, given the fact that I expect too much of the president, what do I expect? And the answer is communal organization on an enormous scale. So here we are. This is, for the benefit of the people watching at home, this is the beginning of March in 2011. And in the last 5 weeks, we've had regime change by community in, is it 5 countries? 5. As I sit here, the normally docile, fat and happy American workers are en masse picketing the state capitol in Madison, Wisconsin, in the snow. These people are feeling good, actually. Have you seen the video? They're not actually that angry because they suddenly have discovered their community. Why? They have stopped watching television. They are relating to each other, and when people relate to each other, as you have experienced at a good football game, people feel great. And so all those, even in Libya, where people are, they've basically, the Libyans, like, they've kind of got it together and they've gone, you know, there's a 1 in 200 chance I could die today. I think I'll take that chance because this is so great that I'm going to take that chance. So we have people dying because they are so excited by and turned on and transformed by their communal experience. So the Chinese have got a real big problem on their hands because they're trying to stop it. Countries that have been controlling people through television are hosed, and that includes our country. Our country, the United States, has been controlled by television since Ronald Reagan. We've had embedded journalists. You know, give me a break. American Idol is the most popular show on American television. Right now, it's kind of hilarious. They want to unfund the last bastion of media that actually thinks, public broadcasting. It's like a joke. But you see the communal spirit erupting. And I think, so that's a long answer to your question, but I do believe that your question was what happens and how powerful is video interaction. And my answer is it's the most powerful manifestation of the communalism that is erupting around this technology, and that is transforming our societies in a really profound way. And so when I look out 10 years, I'm really glad that I'm under-leveraged. I'm really glad that I have my little place in the country, because I think it's going to be a really distressing 10 years as we transform ourselves from this society that was structured in this way around the notion of the individual to the future society within which there is communalism. And the final point I'll make about that is whatever happens in the democracy happens in the business organization. So if you have a look at the way businesses are structured, the way they command or control or influence and manage, or whatever your current hip MBA language is, they replicate the society structure as a whole. So command and control in companies like Coca-Cola failed until they reformulated their management structure to represent a kind of more a leadership under Douglas Draft, who came in from Australia, and he created a global organization which was more listening and flexible, and it wasn't command and control. And so those kind of changes are going to be sweeping through businesses. And in that world, you're going to have to be a super flexible, communal, creative person, because otherwise you won't know how to deal with everybody. And so going back to the story about Apple, it's a creative company. Peter Drucker would like this company. It's a creative company within which individuals feel like individuals, but has an amazing sense of community and has good leadership. And so, and everybody goes, why is it so successful? I go, well, it's a great place to work.